Sometimes in the NFL, life comes at you very fast. 2 years ago, the Denver Broncos, behind that great defense and a historically washed-up quarterback in Peyton Manning, went on to win Super Bowl 50. It seems like that was a long time ago, but that was only 2 short seasons ago. Again, it's amazing how quickly life in the NFL can hit you and hit you fast. Because 2 years after winning the Super Bowl, the Denver Broncos are now picking in the top 5. This was a very precipitous drop in the stock of that organization, in the performance and production of that organization, and what the hell happened. Now, heading into this season, I really wasn't that huge on the chances for this team, because I looked at a questionable quarterback situation, more on that in a moment, with a lack of weapons overall on offense outside of Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. What else did they really have? And then you look at the defense, the retirement of DeMarcus Ware, departures in free agency, and so forth. Eventually, those chickens come home to roost. The trading away of TJ Ward and so on and so forth, those chickens come home to roost. And it was interesting because early on in the year, it looked like the Denver Broncos might be able to kind of stub the tide. They started off 3-1, and you're thinking maybe they'll stay in the mix in the AFC West. And then you got to that Sunday night game, if you remember, in Denver against the Giants, the previously winless Giants. And this just seemed like it was opportunity served up on a silver platter. The Giants had just lost Brandon Marshall and, most importantly, Odell Beckham Jr. They had really nothing, in theory, on the offensive side of the ball. They hadn't won a game. It's in Denver. It's prime time. The Broncos should blow these jokers out of the water, especially with the 3-1 start. And again, life in the NFL can come at you fast. You never know what could happen because the Giants dominated the Broncos in that game, and it started a 2+ month stretch for the Broncos where they just sucked tying tit. It kicked off an 8-game losing streak, which eliminated any and all hope or chance for this Denver Broncos team in 2017. Now, to sit there and solely blame the quarterback situation would be foolish, because it takes a team to make a champion, it takes a team to destroy a champion. But the problems begin with the quarterback position. And to sit there and think that it was wise to go into a season with a mediocre Trevor Siemian and a completely unproven, questionable guy in Paxton Lynch as the backup, and then in the middle of the season, when it becomes apparent that your quarterback situation is a complete and total mess and you're in the middle of this 8-game slide, you go back to the Brock Osweiler tree. Like, you should have been thankful as an organization that Houston took him off your damn hands. And you bring him back? You brought Brock Osweiler back! That just gives you an indication of how bad the situation was in Denver at the quarterback position in 2017. You know, it just in general, you look at the stepping down by Gary Kubiak with health issues, Wade Phillips departing and going to the Rams to be their defensive coordinator. You had major upheaval in the coaching staff, and you follow that up with a mediocre to flat out, let's just call it what it is, doo-doo ass terrible quarterback situation. It's not surprising to see that the Broncos had an 8-game losing streak and they finished 5-11 even after fooling everybody and starting the season 3-1. Because when you look at the Broncos team, the defense was starting to quit, it felt like, because they were frustrated with the offense, understandably so, but you still should be professional. You should still be better. You know, Aqib Talib has his issues at times. This defense sometimes would show up, sometimes they wouldn't. You had an offense that really felt like consistently struggled to run the football with any type of consistency that you could really count on. And obviously, having Thomas and Sanders on the outside, even though Sanders was gone for several games with injury, really doesn't matter when you have Trevor Siemian, Brock Osweiler, and Paxton Lynch as your 3-headed monster at the quarterback position. Who cares? It's not going to matter. Because you can't imagine when you're an opposing team and you're going into your film study that you truly worried about anybody other than Von Miller. Like, he's the one player that imparts any fear. He's the one player that you're really truly scared of. And you can say Aqib Talib can still be really good, but I don't think he's the type of guy that instills fear in an opposing team. But Von Miller is. But that is it. And there most certainly is nobody on the offensive side of the ball that opposing defenses and coaching staffs have to game plan for, that they sit there and say, well, we've got to stop him. We've got to... No, you don't have to do shit. A mediocre offensive line, a 2 wide receiver team that didn't have one of those wide receivers for several weeks, a team with no real threat at the tight end position, average running game, and terrible quarterback play. That's got all the makings of a 5-11 picking in the top 5 football team, which is exactly what the Denver Broncos were. Now, the interesting question as we got through the season and we got to the end of the season was new head coach Vance Joseph going to get a second year? And I don't think this was a guarantee or a certainty that he was going to. Now, I was a fan of this hiring, in part because I said you should trust in John Elway. He just recently brought you a Super Bowl. If this is the guy he thought was the one to get the job done, you should have some faith in that. And I still somewhat stand behind that, but obviously the year one results weren't great, and it did bring some questions about John Elway and his micromanaging and his leadership style that need to be addressed. But ultimately, it came down to, are you really going to blame Vance Joseph for inheriting a quarterback situation which revolved around Trevor Siemian, Paxton Lynch, and then eventually Brock Osweiler? Is that fair to anybody? Anybody whatsoever? And the simple answer is, of course not. So cooler heads prevailed, even though there could have been an argument to be made for letting Vance Joseph go. John Elway, I feel like, made the fair decision and decided to give Vance Joseph a second year. Even though you looked at one point in time, it seemed like the team had quit on him. At the end of the year, they started to play a little bit harder. But if you could encapsulate this 2017 season into a nutshell, it's a late season game, and the Broncos are getting their teeth kicked in. And here's Brock Osweiler. Brock Osweiler, who completely sucks, going around and yelling at guys on the sideline like that's going to motivate them. If it was John Elway coming down and he was suited up in uniform and he said that shit, he won 2 Super Bowls. He's a Hall of Famer. He's the face of this franchise for all time. Okay, it makes sense. If Peyton Manning would have done that, even washed up at the end of his career, Peyton Manning, he has all that legacy, Super Bowl champion, all of that. If Peyton Manning comes around and starts yelling at people, by God, you're going to freaking listen because he's earned that right. Brock Osweiler has earned nothing except scorn and mock. And that's exactly what it looked like his teammates did when they just completely tuned him out. So, nonetheless, Vance Joseph gets a second year. We'll see if he ends up getting a third one. There's no question that the seat is going to be very hot on him heading into 2018. Now, in terms of this offseason, you look at this team, and part of the problem with when you go for it, when you have the Peyton Mannings and you go for it with the DeMarcus Wares and you sign players in free agencies like the Emmanuel Sanders, the TJ Wards, and so forth, you get to a point in time where eventually, again, those chickens are going to come home to roost. And while the Denver Broncos aren't totally screwed in terms of the salary cap, they don't have a ton of cap space because they've lost players and so on and so forth. They only have, I think it's about $26 million in cap space. Now, maybe they'll make some type of salary cap moves. Maybe they'll cut somebody like an Aqib Talib. And maybe, honestly, at this point, that would be the best thing for the organization is to get that nutcase out of there. Because when he's good, he's good. And when he's not, he screws everything up. So maybe they will finally get rid of him. We'll see. Clear up a little more salary cap space. But the thing is they really, if you look at the Broncos, they have enough cap space to make one big move, especially if they make some maneuvering. And everybody's going to assume it's going to be at the quarterback position, and rightfully so. Are they going to go after Kirk Cousins? Are they going to go after a Case Keenum? Maybe a Teddy Bridgewater? I don't know. We're going to find out. But you would have to expect, and I would assume at this point in time, it's going to be Kirk Cousins, that they will go after him and go after him very hard. Because they have to know they cannot go back into 2018 with the quarterback situation that they have. Especially 2 years after sinking a first-round pick in Paxton Lynch, do you want to really go right back into the well in the top 5 of the draft by drafting yet another quarterback? You have already admitted that Paxton Lynch has failed. Now you've got to sit there and wait to develop this guy, who might only be the 3rd or 4th best quarterback in that draft, depending on who ends up being available, who you end up taking. Or are you better off, if you're the Broncos, bringing in a veteran proven commodity where you have some talent on the outside, maybe bring in a little bit of talent around him, and you feel like the defense will be revitalized and you might be able to make a run. Usually I'm not an advocate for signing quarterbacks in free agency unless they're like special type of players, because ultimately, as a general rule, you don't win Super Bowls historically, especially in the modern NFL, with free agent quarterbacks. You just don't. Championship teams draft and develop their guys. They just do. Sure, there are exceptions to the rule. The Broncos a couple of years ago were one of them. But again, you were talking about Peyton Manning. And frankly, honestly, back in 2015, again, how quickly times change, there was an argument back then a couple of years ago that Brock Osweiler was better at that time than Peyton Manning was. And what did it really matter with that defense anyways, especially going up against Cam Newton and Carolina in the Super Bowl and the way they've structured their offensive game plan? I don't think it would have. So I would expect this team to be very heavily into Kirk Cousins, although I have one request. If we're going to go down the free agent path, let's go bring in Mr. Type 1 himself, make this crap full circle, and have him come back home. The Denver Broncos need to sign Jay Cutler. Ow, baby, can you imagine? Cuddy comes back home. Type 1 kid is back, baby. Have your insulin shots ready, baby. Oh, man. And watch Elway do something like that. Lose out on a Kirk Cousins, lose out on a Case Keenum, lose out on a Teddy Bridgewater, and decide that the best route to go down is Jay Cutler. Please, please, if there are football gods, let this happen. Give the Broncos fans what they really don't want, so that way I can troll them all throughout 2018. Can you imagine, football gods, if you exist, the material that I would have if Jay Cutler went back to the Denver Broncos, meaning somebody else gave him double-digit millions to be a starting quarterback still in the NFL in 2018? It would be glorious. Absolutely glorious. But anyways, a guy could dream. Moving on, though. You look at the Denver Broncos now, and you really get to an important offseason, especially when it comes to the draft. Because 2 years after winning the Super Bowl again, they're picking in the top 5. They've got, in terms of their draft selections, they've got the first pick, which is in the 5th overall slot. You've got a 2nd rounder, a 3rd rounder, a couple of 4ths, a couple of 5ths, a 6th, and a 7th round pick. So there is some draft pick currency there, and they have some premium picks in the first few rounds. So the Denver Broncos could potentially be in a situation, even though recent draft history hasn't been all that great, but again, that could tie into picking very late in each round, that this is a very important draft for John Elway and that front office. They've really got to get it right here. Now, when you look at the draft needs, assuming they don't get a quarterback at free agency, then quarterback clearly becomes the number one need. Now, who's it going to be? Would it be a Josh Allen? Would it be a Lamar Jackson? Would it be a Josh Rosen? Would they trade up big to get a Sam Darnold? Would it be a Baker Mayfield? Frankly, I don't know if we know at this point what would appeal to John Elway, because looking at his quarterback situation, it seems like he likes big, immobile guys that can't throw. So lead you to believe Mason Rudolph or Josh Rosen. But if Rosen could throw a little, I'm kidding. Not that much, though. But quarterback is the number one need. But assuming they take care of that position in free agency or trade somehow, some way, where else should they look at? They've got to get better at tight end. They've had menial talent at tight end the past couple of years. They need a difference maker back like when they had Julius Thomas in that system. No, he hasn't been a game breaker since, but he was in that system. It makes Sanders and Thomas better. It makes the running game better. They need another threat over the middle of the field, and they need one of those guys in this draft, whether that means somebody like a Dallas Goedert from South Dakota State, a Mark Andrews from Oklahoma. If that means they would have to trade back up into the tail and portion around one to get one of those guys, they need one really bad. They can still use some work on their offensive line, I think specifically on the interior line, but also on the defense. They could use another edge rusher to go with Von Miller and Shane Ray, because one of the keys to success in the NFL, along with being able to run the football in the fourth quarter, is to be able to have a fourth quarter pass rush. And right now their fourth quarter pass rush, I really feel like, consistently consists of Von Miller, and that is pretty much it. So you can never have enough edge rushers in theory when you play a 3-4. But they could use some depth in the secondary, especially if they decide long-term they're not going to keep Bradley Roby, if they cut a kid to leave. They could use some guys on the outside. I feel like they could also use an upgrade again at the running back position, but it's something they could probably address on day 3 of this draft, because this is a solid running back class again. But ultimately for the Broncos, this offseason comes down to this very simply. Whether it's free agency or the draft or a trade, they must find a quarterback that could pay off dividends in 2018, and then they must help him, get him some better talent on the offensive side of the ball, and get some athletic talent on the defensive side of the ball to provide some young depth that this organization lacks.